The Arctic tundra stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast frozen expanse untouched by time. 30-year-old Daniel Carter, a seasoned wildlife photographer, adjusted the settings on his camera, focusing on the pristine white landscape before him. His breath formed small clouds in the icy air as he steadied his hands, determined to capture the perfect shot. For years, Daniel had traveled across the globe in search of nature's most elusive moments. He had photographed the sweeping plains of Africa, the dense rainforests of the Amazon, and the towering peaks of the Himalayas. But the Arctic had always been his dream destination. The untouched beauty of the tundra, the sheer isolation, and the chance to document creatures that thrived in one of the harshest climates on Earth. It was the challenge he had been waiting for. His sled dogs, a team of 6 strong and well-trained huskies, waited patiently a few feet away, their thick coats dusted with snow. Kyle, his lead dog, stood at the front, ears perked as if sensing something in the wind. Daniel smiled. Kale had been his companion for years, guiding him through some of the most treacherous terrains he had ever encountered. The day had started perfectly. The sky was a deep shade of blue, the sun casting a golden glow over the snow-covered landscape. Daniel had planned his route meticulously, ensuring that he would make it back to base camp before nightfall. But as any seasoned explorer knew, nature was unpredictable. A sudden gust of wind whipped across the tundra, sending a spray of ice into the air. Daniel shivered involuntarily. The temperature had already been well below freezing, but now it seemed to drop even further. He glanced at the sky. Heavy clouds were rolling in from the north, dark and ominous. He knew what that meant. A storm was coming. Daniel quickly packed his camera gear, securing it inside his insulated backpack. He had spent enough time in extreme environments to recognize the signs of an impending blizzard, and he had no intention of being caught in the middle of one. "Come on, Kyle," he called, whistling sharply. The dogs immediately perked up, their muscles tensing as they prepared to move. He secured the sled's harness and gave the command to start. The team surged forward, their powerful legs digging into the snow as they sped across the ice. The wind howled around him, growing stronger with each passing minute. Snowflakes swirled in the air, at first delicate and light, but soon turning into a thick, blinding curtain. Within moments, visibility dropped to near zero. Daniel's heart pounded as he urged the dogs forward. The path he had so carefully mapped out was gone, swallowed by the relentless snow. The once clear landmarks had vanished, replaced by an endless white void. Then it happened. A massive gust of wind struck the sled with brutal force, tipping it to one side. Before Daniel could react, the sled flipped over, throwing him violently into the snow. His head struck something hard, and everything went black. When Daniel regained consciousness, a sharp, throbbing pain pulsed in his skull. His eyelashes were frozen, tiny ice crystals clinging to them as he blinked groggily. The storm had subsided, leaving behind an eerie silence. He tried to move, but his limbs were stiff, his muscles aching from the cold. He forced himself to sit up, shaking off the layer of snow that had partially buried him. He took slow, steady breaths, trying to fight off the panic rising in his chest. The sled was gone. Most of his gear was missing. His provisions, emergency supplies, and even his radio, everything had disappeared into the storm. But he wasn't alone. A low, familiar whimper reached his ears. Daniel turned his head and saw Call standing a few feet away, his thick fur coated in ice, his blue eyes filled with worry. "Hey, boy," Daniel murmured, his voice hoarse. He reached out a gloved hand, and Call immediately trotted over, pressing his nose against Daniel's cheek. The warmth of the dog's breath was a small comfort in the freezing wilderness. Daniel forced himself to think logically. He had survived a storm before, but never under these conditions. He was stranded in an unknown part of the tundra, with no way of contacting help. His best chance was to find shelter before nightfall. Pushing himself to his feet, he took a shaky step forward. The snow was deep, making every movement an exhausting effort. He had no choice but to rely on Kale. The Malamute had an uncanny sense of direction, and had led him out of dangerous situations in the past. "Find shelter, Cole," he said firmly. The dog lifted his head, sniffing the air before bounding forward, his instincts taking over. Daniel followed, his body numb with cold, but his mind focused on survival. Hours passed, though it felt like an eternity. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a pale orange glow over the endless white landscape. Daniel followed his gaze and saw it, a dark shape barely visible against the snow, a structure partially buried under ice and frost. Hope surged through him. Summoning the last of his strength, he stumbled toward it. As he got closer, he realized it was an old research outpost, abandoned and weathered by time. The door was frozen shut, but with enough force he managed to shove it open. The interior was dark and frigid, but it was shelter. Daniel hurried inside, Cole right behind him. He scanned the small room, his flashlight illuminating remnants of what had once been a working station. Rusted equipment, broken furniture, and scattered papers. He found a small metal stove in the corner and searched frantically for anything that could serve as fuel. To his relief, he found a crate of old wooden planks. With frozen fingers, he managed to ignite a fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across the walls. Cole curled up beside him, his warm body pressed against Daniel's side. As the fire crackled, Daniel let out a long, slow breath. For the first time since the storm had hit, he felt a sliver of hope. But just as he allowed his eyes to close, a sound cut through the silence. A whisper, low, faint, almost like the wind sneaking through the cracks in the walls. But this was different. It sounded human. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He held his breath, listening. The whisper came again, closer this time. His blood ran cold. He wasn't alone. Daniel had survived in the wild before, but never under conditions this dire. He knew the rules: find shelter before the Arctic night set in, or risk freezing to death. The temperature would plummet below anything his body could withstand. He had to keep moving. Kyle, his loyal Malamute, walked a few paces ahead, his black and white coat blending into the swirling snow. The dog's breath came in rapid puffs of vapor, his ears alert, nose to the wind. Kale had saved Daniel more times than he could count, guiding him through treacherous terrain where maps and compasses failed. This time was no different. With every step, Daniel's body grew heavier, exhaustion settling deep into his muscles. His thick boots crunched against the ice, his legs trembling under layers of frozen clothing. His gloves were stiff with frost, and despite his best efforts, he could barely feel his fingers. The blizzard had stolen his sled and most of his supplies, leaving him with only the essentials strapped to his back. A hunting knife, a few protein bars, a metal flask of water already starting to freeze. Just as despair began to claw at him, Carl stopped. The dog's ears flattened, his body tense. He let out a low, warning growl. Daniel followed his gaze and squinted into the distance. At first, all he saw was white, an endless frozen wasteland. Then, through the shifting snowfall, he noticed a dark outline against the icy horizon. A structure. His heart pounded. It was partially buried under layers of ice and frost, but unmistakable. An old building. Maybe a hunting cabin, maybe an abandoned research station. Either way, it meant shelter. "Good boy, Cale," Daniel muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Summoning the last of his strength, he pushed forward, forcing his numb legs to move. The closer he got, the clearer the structure became. A metal outpost, its surface rusted and battered by years of brutal Arctic conditions. Reaching the entrance, he ran a gloved hand over the door. Ice had formed thick layers around the edges, sealing it shut. He gritted his teeth and shoved against it with his shoulder. The door groaned, metal scraping against metal, but didn't budge. Desperate, he pulled out his hunting knife and wedged it into the icy seal, chipping away with stiff, frozen hands. The cold burned his skin, but he kept working. After what felt like an eternity, the ice finally gave way. With a final push, the door creaked open, revealing total darkness inside. Daniel hesitated. The air that rushed out was stale, untouched for years. He stepped in cautiously, Cole following close behind, his paws silent against the metal floor. The interior was small, one main room, scattered with overturned chairs and dusty shelves. Against the far wall, an old metal stove sat covered in frost. A cracked window let in the faintest sliver of light, illuminating the abandoned space. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Daniel hurried to the stove, checking the compartments. His luck held. Inside, he found a few logs of firewood, brittle but dry. He pulled out his lighter, hands shaking as he struck it. The small flame flickered, then caught on the wood. Within minutes, warmth spread through the tiny space. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Call curled up beside him, his thick fur pressing against Daniel's side. The rhythmic rise and fall of the dog's chest was reassuring. For the first time since the storm hit, Daniel allowed himself to close his eyes. Just as sleep threatened to take him, a sound echoed through the station. A whisper. His eyes snapped open. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then it came again, faint, almost human. Daniel sat up, every muscle in his body rigid. He scanned the room, his heart hammering against his ribs. The fire cast flickering shadows along the walls, the light twisting and stretching with every movement. Kyle's ears twitched. The dog lifted his head, his body tense. The whispering sound drifted again, this time from the far side of the room. Daniel swallowed hard. He reached for his hunting knife, gripping it tightly. Slowly, he stood, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Hello?" His voice barely carried. Silence. Daniel took a cautious step forward. The floor creaked beneath his boots. He moved toward an old storage cabinet, its wooden doors slightly ajar. A gust of wind howled outside, rattling the window. Then, another whisper. He reached out and yanked the cabinet door open. Nothing, just dust, a few rusted cans and an old lantern. His pulse pounded in his ears. Maybe he was imagining it, the exhaustion, the cold, his mind playing tricks. But Kyle didn't relax. The dog's eyes remained locked on something unseen, his body stiff. The fire crackled behind them, casting strange shapes along the walls. Shadows that shifted unnaturally. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to steady his thoughts. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe. Or maybe he wasn't alone. Daniel didn't sleep. Even after the whispers faded into silence, unease sat heavy in his chest. He kept his knife within reach, his back pressed against the cold metal wall of the outpost. Cale lay beside him, his body warm but tense, his ears flicking at the slightest sound. The fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced across the room. Daniel tried to convince himself it was just the wind. The Arctic was an unforgiving place. Sounds could carry strangely over the ice, playing tricks on the mind. He'd been alone too long, running on exhaustion and adrenaline, and yet the whispers had felt too close. At some point, his body betrayed him, dragging him into a restless sleep. His dreams were disjointed, flashes of movement in the dark, breath on the back of his neck, a presence watching from just beyond the fire's glow. Then, a sound. A sharp, distinct crunch. Daniel's eyes shot open. Footsteps. Not the shifting groan of the wind or the creak of old metal. This was different. This was deliberate. Call was already awake, his body rigid, his head low, ears flattened. A deep growl rumbled from his chest. Daniel didn't move, barely breathed. He strained his ears, heart hammering. Another crunch. Closer this time. Someone, or something, was outside. Slowly, Daniel reached for his knife, gripping the handle with white-knuckled fingers. His mind raced. Who would be out here? The outpost was abandoned. The storm had made travel nearly impossible. A rescuer? No. Why wouldn't they call out? Another survivor? Unlikely. That left other possibilities, none of them good. Cole let out a sharp bark, standing abruptly. Daniel tensed, his pulse spiking. The footsteps outside paused. A long, suffocating silence stretched between them. Then, bang. The door shook violently, as if something had slammed against it. Daniel jolted to his feet, positioning himself between the entrance and the fire. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, his grip tightening around the knife. Coyle barked again, louder this time, his body bristling with tension. The door rattled once more, the metal groaning under pressure. Daniel's mind screamed for him to act, to do something. But what? His supplies were limited, his body weak from cold and exhaustion. Another bang, harder this time. The hinges creaked. Whoever, or whatever, was outside wasn't leaving. Then, as suddenly as it started, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Daniel strained to listen, his ears buzzing with tension. The wind outside howled, but beneath it he swore he heard breathing. Heavy, labored. Then footsteps retreating, slow, measured, fading into the night. Daniel stood frozen, every muscle in his body locked in place. He exchanged a glance with Kyle, the dog still growling low in his throat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel forced himself to move. His body shook as he crept toward the door, his breath fogging in the cold air. He hesitated, then pressed his ear against the metal. Nothing. Minutes passed. Still nothing. Carefully, he reached for the latch, his fingers trembling. He unlocked it with agonizing slowness, then, in one swift motion, yanked the door open. The Arctic night stretched before him, vast and merciless. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, untouched. The landscape was eerily still. But there, just beyond the outpost's entrance, was proof that he hadn't imagined it. Footprints, large, deep, leading away into the storm, and beside them, partially buried in the snow, a handprint, long, inhuman. Daniel's stomach turned to ice. Something had found him, and it wasn't gone, not yet. Daniel slammed the door shut. His breath came fast, each exhale a cloud of mist in the freezing air. He bolted the latch and took a step back, his mind racing. The handprint outside. It wasn't human. It was too long, the fingers too spindly, the proportions just slightly wrong. Cale barked sharply, pacing near the door, his tail stiff, his eyes locked on the entrance as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Daniel forced himself to move. He crouched near the fire, grabbing his flashlight and fumbling with the switch. The batteries were weak, but the dim beam flickered to life, illuminating the room in a cold, pale glow. He needed a plan. His supplies were running low. He had enough food for another day, maybe two if he rationed carefully. The outpost had been abandoned for years, and anything useful had either rotted away or been buried under ice. If he stayed here, he'd freeze or starve long before rescue arrived. But now, staying felt like the safest option, because something was out there, something that had found him, and it wanted in. Daniel forced himself to stay awake. The hours passed slowly, the fire crackling softly, its warmth barely keeping the deep chill at bay. Every so often he'd shine his flashlight toward the door, half expecting to see it bending inward, something forcing its way through. But nothing came. Cole eventually settled beside him, though the dog never fully relaxed. His ears twitched at every sound, his nose occasionally sniffing the air as if catching a scent Daniel couldn't. Outside, the wind howled, but beneath it, something else. A whisper? Not the eerie sound from before. This was closer. A single word, spoken in a voice not quite human. Daniel. His blood ran cold. He shot up, gripping his knife so tightly his knuckles turned white. His flashlight beam darted across the room, over the frost-covered walls, the broken equipment, the worn-down furniture. Nothing. Then, a shadow moved. Not inside the outpost. Outside, right by the window. The frost-covered glass made it hard to see, but there was no mistaking it. Something stood just beyond the thin barrier of ice. Daniel's breath hitched. He took a slow step back, trying to steady his shaking hands. Cole growled low, his body tense. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, impossibly, a slow, deliberate tap on the window. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. Another tap. A long, claw-like finger dragged across the frost, cutting a thin line through the ice. Daniel's mind screamed at him to do something, anything. Cale barked, snapping the silence like a gunshot. The shadow twitched, then it was gone. Vanished into the night. Daniel didn't move for a long time. Finally, he crept toward the window, his breath shallow, his skin crawling. The frost-covered glass was still mostly opaque, but as he got closer, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. Something scrawled into the ice. A single word, scratched by long, clawed fingers. Run.